everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome back to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
And I am Mr. Deril. Today, we are going to talk about a classic British novel, Jane Eyre.
By Charlotte Bronte.
Well, how old were you when you read this classic novel, Ms. Maka?
I guess I was in my early teens. Yes, and I was quite impressed for that time, I think.
It would have left a big impact on you, I think, if you had read it at that time.
Definitely. It was really interesting, and I strongly recommend this book to children.
Very good.
But before we look at the book into details, let's see what is our agenda. So first, traditionally, we are looking at the vocabulary during the session. Then we will talk about the author. And after, we will talk about the summary. So we will tell you in short, what is the story about?
And of course, the story needs to move with the help of characters. So we will look at characters next. Then we have a look at the setting, when it happened, where it happened. And from there, we will swing to why things happen in the book with a look at the main themes.
Yes, and finally, we are going to wrap everything up and give you an interesting homework.
Excellent. Now, I think we should start with the vocabulary list of the day. We have 8 words that we want you to focus on, and these are them. These are they. Let's start with the first word, and it is orphan. Orphan. And this is a child with no parents.
Oboli.
Next, we have a verb, to abuse. To abuse. This is to hurt someone in some way, emotionally, physically, psychologically.
Yes, and this is in Georgian, sastikad mopqroba.
Our next word is governess. Governess. And this is a woman, usually, generally, who is employed to take charge of a child's upbringing, education, and so on, to shape the child.
Აღმზრდელი ქალი.
Our next word is mansion. Mansion. This is a very large and impressive, almost aristocratic house. This is so it's not a palace, but it is a rich house.
Yes. Didi, didruli sahli.
Our next word is to propose. To propose. This is to offer or suggest some kind of topic for consideration, for acceptance, or for action to be done on this thing.
შეთავაზება.
Next, we have clergyman. Clergyman. This is a member of the clergy, which is a religious order, so a religious person.
სასულიერო პირი.
Next, we have a word that's connected to the previous word, and this is missionary. Missionary. It's a person sent by the church to spread the word of their church to other people, spread the word.
Yes, and it sounds exactly the same in Georgian, I think. Missionary.
That is very similar. And our last word is blind. Blind. This is when you are unable to see or use your eyes at all.
Usinathlo. Okay, Daryl. Now let's have a quick question to our audience from the vocabulary part. What is the job of a governess?
To teach kids different language and take care of them to make them better person.
Oh, yes, exactly. Thank you very much.
A bit like what teachers might be expected to do these days.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's move on to the author now.
ახლა მოგიყვებით ავტორის შესახებ.
And our author is Charlotte Bronte, one of the classic British authors of the 19th century. And her novel Jane Eyre is considered a classic of Western literature. She was born in 1816, so early part of the 19th century, in Yorkshire, England. And she was the most dominant and ambitious of the Brontes. Charlotte was raised in a strict Anglican home by her clergyman father, and she grew up religious, but she rejected it in a way.
Yes. Charlotte Bronte worked as a teacher and as a governess before working on the poetry book with her two sisters. In 1847, she published the semi-autobiographical novel, Jane Eyre, which later would become a literary classic.
That leads to a good question I'd like to ask the audience. So she used events from her life in the book. Is it good when writers use events from their own lives in their novels?
Yes, because it makes the plot more realistic, more emotional, and it helps the readers to relate to the characters.
I would agree. I think there's more realism when you have a story that's based on real things and real emotions as well.
Yes, definitely. That's what we are expected to read in Jane Eyre's book.
Okay, speaking of that book, let's move to the summary of Jane Eyre, the book. It's about a young orphan who was raised by Mrs. Reed, a cruel, wealthy aunt. There's a very kind servant as well, Bessie, in the house, and she's a positive influence. She tells stories, she even sings songs to Jane as she grows up.
Yes, and one day she fought with her cousin, John Reed, and Mrs. Reed is so angry that she locks Jane Eyre in a red room. Actually, this is the room where her uncle, Jane's uncle, died. So Jane is so frightened that she thinks that she saw the ghost of her uncle. She is so frightened that she faints. When she wakes up, she's already with a very kind woman, her governess, who actually told lots of stories to her, and also Mr. Lloyd. So this Mr. Lloyd is the person who suggests Mrs. Reed to send Jane to a school called Lowood. Mrs. Reed actually agrees. Of course, she's very happy to agree with this. And Jane spends 8 years at Lowood, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher.
After those 2 years teaching, Jane wants new experiences, as we all do. She starts as a governess position at a manor called Thornfield, where she teaches a lively French girl named Adele. Jane's employer at Thornfield is a dark, impassioned man named Mr. Rochester, and Jane secretly falls in love with him. Soon, Rochester, in fact, asks her to marry him, and she agrees.
The wedding day arrives. Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester are already preparing to exchange their vows when Mr. Mason's voice cries out and says that Mr. Rochester has got a wife. Mr. Rochester does not deny this fact, but he explains that his wife has gone mad. But Jane Eyre realizes she can't stay with Mr. Rochester anymore, and she leaves Thornfield. Of course, to know more about this story, you need to read the book. But what do you think? Does this book have a happy ending? So, do you think this romantic story should end in a good way? Or it might have a bit of a sad ending? Let's see.
I think we should ask the audience that question. Do all romantic stories have to have a happy ending to be called a romantic story?
Yes, it is a good example and it leaves great emotions. But a classic story like Romeo and Juliet has a bad ending for love, but it can also be a very good example so that we are ready for both good and bad.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, I think that's what the books are for, right? To study something, to give us good examples.
Yes, and that is the purpose of a good book, to open up life experiences in an interesting and illuminating way.
That's true.
Okay, and on that note, let's begin with our characters.
ახლა ვისაუბრებთ მოთხრობის გმირებზე.
Indeed. We start with the main girl herself, Jane Eyre, the girl that the book is named after. She's the central character of this book. She's obviously, she's an intelligent, independent woman with a passionate nature, but she also realizes the dangers that she can get into and controls herself.
Yes, although she's a very rebellious woman, she knows that she should have a reason to fight for. And that's why she's also very cautious. Intellectual, faithful, loving, Jane Eyre is one of the most original, vivid characters, woman characters of 19th century.
Very good. We have another character, Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed. We meet her at the beginning of the novel, in fact, when the young orphan Jane is still living at Gateshead Hall. Mrs. Reed treats her more like an unwanted guest than a family member. When she finally gets the chance, she sends Jane away to a boarding school for orphans.
Yes, and in the story, she's described as a cold person who does not really care of a little girl's destiny. She actually breaks her promise to her husband, Jane Eyre's uncle. She promised her that she would take care of a little girl, but she didn't.
Our next character is Mr. Rochester. He's a wealthy landowner from Thornfield Hall, where Jane, if you remember, starts to work as a governess. When he's introduced as a bit of a man close to his 40s, between 35 and 40. And as you remember, Jane is a lot younger, so there's a big age gap between them.
Yes, and in the novel, he's described as a dark man with stern features and heavy brow. He is considered not to be handsome, and this is to show that Jane was not really interested in his physical appearance, but in his intelligence and kind heart. From the very beginning, it is difficult to see that Mr. Rochester is a kind man, but not for Jane Eyre. She, from the very beginning, realizes that he has a kind heart.
Now, our next character is Bertha Mason. Bertha Mason. She is the only daughter of a wealthy family living overseas. And according to Rochester, Bertha was famous for her beauty. So she was known for being a beauty, and she was the pride of the town, like the talk of the town, as we say in English.
Yes, and do you know where they met each other?
No?
So they met each other at a ball where Mr. Rochester attended also, and also this Bertha's brother. So they started living as a husband and wife in Jamaica. So Mr. Rochester was attracted by Bertha's appearance and maybe wealth. In the book, Bertha is introduced as some kind of a ghost. So because Jane Eyre only hears a scream and knows nothing about this person.
Our last character is St. John Rivers. That's pronounced St. John, an unusual pronunciation, but it is St. John. He's described as a very handsome man, tall, slim, his eyes are large and blue, and he has pale skin. He's also fair, he's got blonde hair as well. So already you can see that he's being contrasted with Mr. Rochester. Rochester's the dark figure, and St. John is the lighter person. And he's also described as being very calm.
Yes, and if we talk about his personality, he is the opposite to the passionate Mr. Rochester, cold and hard-hearted. Although he claims that he's a devout Christian, he really lacks the warmth and compassion that a follower of the Christ should have. He is rather apathetic towards others as well.
Okay, and what we have is a lot of characters with some positive qualities and negative qualities, so complex characters.
Yes.
On that question, I would like to ask this question to our audience. Is there anything that would justify Mrs. Reed's behavior to Jane?
No, because Jane was a little girl and she needed protection. Also, Mrs. Reed broke her promise to her husband.
Well, that's one opinion, yeah. I mean,
Yes.
You could argue that, I think.
Definitely. So that's exactly that we cannot actually justify her behavior, right? Okay, but what about the second question? Why didn't Jane marry St. John?
She did not love him and she just followed her heart.
Yeah. So, and yeah, that's exactly. And she was an independent woman. and she decided everything.
Yeah, and that will be related to some of the main themes we'll talk about, her status as an independent woman.
But before the main themes.
Before the main themes, we've got setting, which is the when and the where of the story, right?
Okay. ახლა ვისაუბრებთ მოქმედების ადგილსა და დროზე.
Very good. I'm going to start with the when of the story. Let's set it in its context. Charlotte Bronte, the author, originally publishes under a male pseudonym, Currer Bell. The novel describes the early decades of the 19th century, and it is structured around 5 separate locations in northern England. The 19th century, though, is often referred to as the Victorian era. After Queen Victoria, she was a long-lived queen, and so her era is known as the Victorian era. It was a time in Britain when they had the Industrial Revolution, they had a lot of social change, and a lot of things were going on, and one of the forces for social change would have been our author, Charlotte Bronte.
Okay, now let's talk about where. So what was the situation for that time? New economic opportunities during this time helped to boost the life expectancy and the quality of life. But it also caused class divides, so that actually remained in Britain for centuries. Previously, England was controlled by the landed gentry. During Victorian times, landed gentry became wealthy business people who owned land. But they still controlled politics and economy.
Mm-hmm. Let's have a look at the where, some of the locations that happen in this novel. Mm-hmm. Gateshead Hall, Lowood, Thornfield Manor, Moorhouse, and Ferndean Manor as well. And these all show a particular class of British society, which is exactly what this novel is addressing, the changes and the changing role of women in this class.
Yes, interesting. Okay, now let's ask a question to our audience. Why did Charlotte Bronte publish her writings, her books, under the male pseudonym? The pseudonym was Currer Bell.
Because women writers were unusual for that time.
Yes, I guess that's right?
That is true. That is true. The male writers were the main writers in the 19th century, and it is only in the 20th century that we have the current culture of
women
equal
writers.
Acceptance. Yeah,
equal acceptance. Exactly. Okay, now let's move on to the main themes. ახლა ვისაუბრებთ მთავარ თემებზე. Of course, main themes are one of the most important parts of our book during discussion. The book. What are our main themes, Mr. Derill?
We have a few, and I will start with the first one. The first one is social class. Mm-hmm. And as we've been talking about, it is quite wrapped up in social class. In Bronte's Eyre, social class is the recurring theme, as class tells what a character can do and can't do. This is because it's the Victorian period, and class determines where you lived, what you could do, and who you could do it to. As for example, marriage. You were not allowed to marry outside of your class, and people generally tended to marry people within their class system.
Yes, that's not really good, I would say. Yeah, but social class is also presented in Jane Eyre through Jane's lack of money and how others saw her because of this. It is also presented through Jane's role as a governess, as a teacher, and the money that she later receives from her uncle's will.
Because it changes her social class here.
Definitely,
when that happens.
yes.
Okay, very good. Our next theme is love and autonomy. Love and autonomy. Now this is similar in the sense that there's certain people you can fall in love with and certain decisions you can make, but you're not allowed to do too many things on your own in this era. In Jane Eyre, Bronte deals with love and how characters respond to emotion. Mm-hmm. Throughout the novel, readers learn the true value of love, how it can benefit others, how Jane responds to love, and how it develops her as a person. Equally, Bronte shows the other side of love, which is hate, and what this can do to individuals.
Yes, but we also mentioned autonomy, right? So Jane could decide who to marry. So she actually refused 2 men, and she was also independently, financially supporting herself. So this is a good example of her being very independent.
Because of her class, it gave her the
Yes.
stability to do so, but others could not, yes.
Yeah. Now let's ask a question to our audience, right? Do you think Jane Eyre's social status will change after she gets money from her uncle's will?
Yes, I think yes, because she will be a businesswoman owning a land, and also she would be a member of the landed gentry.
Yes, of course, I do agree with you, because this will would change everything in her life, right? And also marriage, definitely.
And the thing is that she is a strong, independent woman. So there's 2 things going on here. There's the class that's changing underneath her,
Yeah.
as well as her being a very independent woman herself.
Definitely.
There's a lot more themes in this story that we can talk about, but we will set it aside for people to enjoy when they read the book themselves. I would like to maybe wrap up things a little bit and add a little bit more information as we wrap it up.
Yeah, so of course, first we talked about the author, Charlotte Bronte, who was one of the most vivid female writers in 19th century of English novel writers.
Definitely one of the most important.
Yes.
Next, we talked about the summary. This is the story of the orphan girl who battles through life, the marriage with Rochester, and cruel relatives, and the dark past to Rochester as well.
Yes, and we had characters. The main character is Jane Eyre. We had Mr. Rochester, and we had Mrs. Reed, actually who opens the novel. And then we had, of course, Bertha Mason, the ex-wife of Mr. Rochester, and St. John Rivers, who was going to be the husband of Jane Eyre, but Jane refused.
It is set in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, and that's important as well. It's almost part of the story itself. The context is so important. And it's in northern England. We mentioned a bunch of places earlier. And the setting as well adds a lot to the story. It wouldn't be a Charlotte Bronte story without that particular image of British life.
And the main themes, love versus autonomy, and social class, and the rules, social rules that would tell people how to live and dictate everything.
Okay, one more time. Let's go through the vocabulary with a particular focus on pronunciation from my part and maybe translation from your side.
Yes, I will be pleased to.
Okay, we had orphan.
Oboli.
We had to abuse.
Სასტიკად მოპყრობა.
Next, we had governess.
აღმზრდელი ქალი.
Mansion was next, mansion.
დიდი, მდიდრული სახლი.
Our next verb was to propose.
შეთავაზება.
We had clergyman.
სასულიერო პირი.
Next, we had missionary.
მისიონერი.
And finally, we had blind.
უსინათლო. Mr. Derill, what about the homework? We shouldn't forget that, right?
We shouldn't, although it was not my favorite part in growing up in school, but I think times have changed and
Yeah.
people are willing to do homework, I'm sure. Here's the question we have for the audience members. Think about Jane Eyre, but change the setting. Imagine that Jane lived in the 21st century and is 18 years old. How does she live? How does she behave? And how does she go about her life?
I'm going to say it now in Georgian. შეცვალეთ მოქმედების დრო. წარმოიდგინეთ, რომ ჯეინი ცხოვრობს 21 საუკუნეში და ის არის 18 წლის. როგორ იცხოვრებდა? So, we're waiting for your homeworks.
And you should send your answers to the address that you see on screen.
ველოდებით თქვენს დავალებებს ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
I think that's it, Ms. Maka.
Yeah.
We have spoken a lot about today's novel. We had a good discussion between me and you. We had a great back and forth with the audience. And hopefully we'll get great answers from the audience at home.
Yes, and I think the children are interested in this book. Yeah? Okay, that's all for today. See you next week. Goodbye.
Have a great week.